intention of bringing it up, but, now that we're talking about Whedon and Romo, and at the end of that game, now you hear the buzz coming out. I swear this is not hindsight talking. When the game ended, and I was listening to I was doing some work on the computer, so I was just listening in, kind of background noise, and I'm listening to all the stuff being talked about after the game, and it was funny because one of the announcers, can't remember which one it was, talked about the reinsertion of Tony Romo into the game there at the end. And I still say that was the mistake. I think Whedon was doing well enough that I think that may have hurt them there at the end. But regardless, I noticed that right after the game, they interviewed Jerry Jones in the hallway outside the locker room, and it was like the quote that he gave when they asked him about putting Romo back in, it was word for word the same as what I had just heard the announcer say came from the coach, but it was word for word, not where like it was the same sentiment, and it popped a buzzer in my head. I said, man, isn't that exactly the same thing that the other guy said? And I let it rush off, and then now I hear the headlines coming out of Dallas that there's word that Jerry Jones is the one that made the call from the locker room to put Romo back in the game. What I was thinking, and I'm like, you know what? Now it makes sense why Jerry Jones made the call, most likely, to put the guy that he said, because he said that means he's ready to go out there and play. And I was like, man, I heard that before. And I'm just saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. I do believe that Mr. Jones had a hand in reinserting Tony Romo at the end of that game.
Yeah, that may be, and I hadn't heard that or thought that, but you may be right. I think what the announcers did say coming down the stretch was they were reporting from the broadcast booth that Romo was not hurt seriously, B, lobbying, I think is the word maybe they used, to get back in the game. And, he's such a tough competitor. He's such a gamer. He wants back in there, and speculating that he might be back in towards the end. So they sort of set the table for it on the broadcast for him to come back. And, it just, I don't know why, certainly a concussion is maybe different from taking a helmet to the kidney or whatever. He's obviously protected back there, but he's had some surgery, and they showed the helmet hitting right in the area where his surgery had been. But even before the end of the game, we were getting reports from doctors saying, oh, no, that's heavily padded. That shouldn't be a big problem. And that wouldn't damage any area where he had surgery before. So they were already setting the table to get him back in the game. But, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Jerry Jones, a de facto general manager of the Cowboys, so it's not as if Jimmy Haslam or somebody who doesn't, pretend to be the guy making personnel decisions for the team like a general manager would. But you'd think that decision would be up to head coach / head trainer, or on-field physician, sideline physician, whoever that would be, team doctor, as opposed to, the owner. But I'm sure he'll take some flack for that, even though it's a little bit of a different case than a concussion might be. They would be all over him if it had been a headshot that Romo had taken and the owner intervened to get him back in the game, maybe prematurely.
I'll tell you what.
This probably will pass without too much further comment.
Well, while we're talking about that, actually, Jerry Jones just spoke out earlier this morning about the situation. Tony Romo, it's not as cut and dry just playing again this week as they're talking about now, as apparently it's going to be a game-time decision. Jerry Jones said this morning it's not a season-ending injury, but it could be more serious than people think. His status, of course, right now is being listed as day-to-day. He said it's a pain tolerance issue. As much as he can tolerate the pain, he can play. So clearly this is like one of those injuries that's going to hurt you the rest of the season, and you're just going to have to suck it up and deal with it. But he also denies, as I was saying, that any hands in the pot, that he forced the issue to get Romo back out there the other night in the game. Because like I said, that's one of the stories going around Dallas now, is that he made the call and said, listen, Tony said he's ready, you put him back in the game. And and he literally said as much after the game. I see Bruce in the chat room. If I'm paying someone $25 million, he's playing on crutches. I'm just saying, that's kind of the way Jerry Jones is looking. Look, man, the man said he could play, let him play. Brandon Whedon will officially make his first start as a Dallas Cowboy since his time here. Keep an eye on that here. All right, enough talking about that. I want to switch over to a couple of things. You know what? I wanted to bring up with you. Let's talk about the college playoff poll. Comes out for the first time here yesterday. What were your thoughts? Shake out of that. A little bit different than the coaches poll. You look at there's a few differences in the polls and in the playoff rankings there. But what are your thoughts? Of course, 3 and 4 are going to play each other this weekend.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of matchups, and the thing that really jumps out first of all is people relax, chill, because everything, many things, if not everything, is going to change between now and the 1st of December. I mean, and I just jotted down these team schedules, and let me just, humor me about just take you through some of these things. Like you said, 3 and 4 are playing. If the playoffs started today, the two Mississippi teams, 1 and 4, would play each other, but they're playing each other anyway here in a few weeks. But as you look at it, let's take Mississippi State first. They have 2 games against top 4 teams, and they're both on the road. They play at Alabama. Top 6 teams. Alabama's number 6.
Yeah.
They play at Alabama and at Ole Miss, and they play Arkansas at home this week. So they've got 3 SEC West games, 2 of them on the road. That undefeated thing is going down. I mean, they may have 2 losses before it's all over. Ole Miss also has 2 games versus top 4 teams. They play Auburn this week. They play at Arkansas. That doesn't even count as a top 4. And then they play Mississippi State later. So they've got, again, 3 tough games, one on the road at Arkansas, which is no pushover, against SEC West, teams. Then there's Auburn. Auburn has probably the toughest go. They've got 3 road games. Here's their road games going down the stretch. Ole Miss, at Georgia, and at Alabama. And they play Texas A&M at home in a couple of weeks. So they've got a brutal schedule down the stretch. Florida State probably has the easiest road to the Final Four. They play at Louisville and at Miami. Those are their 2 toughest games, although BC has been good and pulled an upset or 2 earlier in the year. And they have Florida left on the schedule. So they don't have a cakewalk, but they've got 2 reasonably tough road games, or at least the potential for an upset at Louisville, at Miami, and they play the Gators for their final game. Even Alabama, number 6 right now, an easy go of it. They're at LSU. They have Mississippi State and Auburn both still left on the schedule. 2 games versus the top 4 for Bama, plus a trip to Death Valley at LSU. So. It's brutal for these top 4 or 5 teams in terms of their schedules. Guaranteed that thing is going to be jumbled, shuffled, and turned upside down between now and the 1st of December. One thing to answer your question about just observations on what the committee did, they did correct some things that it appears that they value the head-to-head thing more than they look objectively and say, okay, who do we think has the better team? Lots of college football observers believe that Alabama is a better team than Ole Miss. I'm among them. But Ole Miss is ranked ahead of Alabama because Ole Miss beat Alabama. Same thing with Oregon and Michigan State. Oregon's they're in the 5 spot, I believe, and Michigan State number 8. Some of the previous polls had Michigan State ranked over Oregon, even though Oregon took them by a couple of touchdowns in the second game of the year. So the committee obviously has corrected those kinds of things that were anomalies of the coaches poll and the AP poll with voters from all around the country doing their thing, and took that head-to-head thing into account, which is at least encouraging to me.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you your thoughts on some of that, on what they're putting into this. Like when I was looking through some of the different, obviously, strength of schedule, something that popped out to me too, and I'm one of the ones, we've talked about it, of course, over the next few years, Ohio State looking to bolster the schedule, but that's something that people always point at with the Ohio State Buckeyes. I was looking at just the teams from the Buckeyes and above. A couple that snapped out at me is Florida State, very, very near the Buckeyes there when it comes to strength of schedule. Look at the difference. I mean, obviously you've got those SEC teams where theirs is going to be so much stronger. But even Michigan State, man, they've 25 spots in the rankings of strength of schedule separate the Buckeyes from Michigan State as well. But those are teams that, when people are making the comparison, oh, well, the Buckeyes don't play anybody. And I'm not arguing that. I get the point about the Buckeyes non-conference schedule. We've talked about that not just this year, but more the last few years. But I thought that was amazing, especially when you look at the Spartans and there being so much separation, especially because they're in the same conference. But, I was looking at some of these other things that they use to determine this ranking, and it's interesting. It's more of those, it seems to me, some of those convoluted things that are hard to figure out, like game control. I don't know if you saw that ranking, but they figure out somehow how the average top 25 team would control games from start to finish the way this team did given their schedule. And I'm like, man, what does that even mean, let alone how do you figure that out for all of these teams? And just interesting to see some of that and where these teams separate in certain areas. But, I mean, strength of schedule, you can see that even just looking at the top four, Mississippi State, they've got 18th, Florida State 44th, and then Auburn and Ole Miss 2 and 3 in strength of schedule. I mean, that sticks out at you so much, too, there when you're dealing with and we know that, a tougher run of teams that you're playing with. But have you seen some of these different categories that they're using?
Yeah, I've looked at it a little bit, and the strength of schedule thing is also, I don't know, strength of schedule changes as the year goes along. Maybe the best example of that is Notre Dame, which at the start of the year, Phil Steele, I think I mentioned it here, he had them at the number one toughest schedule in the country. And they still have some tough games left, but before the season started, you looked at the Notre Dame schedule and you saw Michigan and Stanford, and now it's sort of like, well, Michigan and Stanford, so what?
Right.
Because both of those teams are down this year when it looked like those were two really rugged games for the Irish. They've got at Arizona State, at Florida State, so obviously those are three very tough games for them. They also play Northwestern and Louisville. A tier down from the top level, but still not, it's not, Navy and Furman, it's two respectable teams that they have to play. They have Navy too, by the way, coming up this week. But, their schedule changes over the course of the season, and when teams that look to be formidable turn out to be not so formidable. But there's no doubt that the SEC West, that those are the teams that are going to be ranked up at the top. Of course, there's been a lot of flaps the last few days with people like Kirk Herbstreit and Chris Fowler coming out to deny that that ESPN has an SEC bias of any sort. Well, of course they do, but they're in denial of the notion that ESPN has a bias towards the SEC. I've said it here many times, probably every week since the season started, that it's clear that the best football in the country is being played down there. In fact, if you just look at the geographical grouping of the top four teams, they're all within a couple hundred miles of each other down there, from Tallahassee up to Oxford, Mississippi, so there's no doubt that the best football in the country is being played in the Southeast, and notably in the Southeast Conference. But still, I think ESPN hypes that conference, and some of the hype that they have, since they have such a stranglehold on the TV broadcasting of college football, that it's bound to be reflected in media and in fan opinions and preferences.
And that's what that's what surprised me, that they had UCLA in this first poll ranked as the number one toughest strength of schedule. I figured for sure it would be an SEC team, but when I had to go back and look and see, and you got Virginia, Memphis, Texas, of course, three top 12 teams, basically Arizona State, Oregon, Arizona coming up for them, Cal, Utah, Colorado. But I was a bit amazed that it wasn't an SEC team so far as having played the toughest according to the strength of schedule breakdown.
Yeah, that is interesting, and the Pac-12 has had a little bit of a resurgence in reputation. Top to bottom, it's a pretty rugged conference these days to play in, especially with in their new members, Utah, knocking some teams off, and Utah's ranked number 17 in the country right now.
They beat UCLA.
Yeah, UCLA certainly a return to prominence for those guys after being down for several years, and both Arizona teams are respectable. Washington coming back around a little bit too. So yeah, they're a conference that's polished up their resume here a little bit in the last few years.
Saw an interesting comment from Keith in the chat room there. What are your thoughts? Okay, you're ranking 4 teams. What do you think is a top 25? I mean, do you think that's a pretty big listing if we're narrowing down on the top 4? Do you think that's more just for an overall kind of focus so you can get an idea for where everybody falls in the bubble, kind of?
Yeah, I think it is, and I think it's just